He was a decorated US Army soldier, a man who took an oath to serve his country with honor and integrity. She was a devoted wife, eagerly awaiting the birth of their first child. Together, they seemed like the perfect American dream. But beneath the surface of their picture-perfect life lay secrets darker than anyone could imagine. Mia Carter had always believed in fairy tales. Growing up in a small Kansas town, she would often dream of a life filled with love, stability, and family, a sharp contrast to her own tumultuous childhood. When Ethan entered her life, he seemed to embody everything she had ever wanted. Tall, with piercing blue eyes and a quiet strength, Ethan was the kind of man who made promises he kept. They met at a charity event for veterans, where Mia was volunteering. Ethan, recently returned from his third deployment, had been quiet and reserved, yet there was something about him that drew her in. Their connection was instant, the kind of magnetic pull that made every moment together feel like destiny. Within a year, they were married in a small ceremony, surrounded by friends and family. For Mia, the past 3 years of their marriage had been everything she had hoped for. Ethan's military career had its challenges, but she admired his dedication to his country. Despite the long deployments and the ever-present fear that something might happen to him, Mia took comfort in the strength of their bond. They were partners, a team ready to face anything together. Or so she thought. Now, standing in their cozy suburban home, surrounded by loved ones celebrating the impending arrival of their first child, Mia felt a deep sense of gratitude. She looked at Ethan, who was engaged in conversation with her brother, and felt a surge of love. "I'm so lucky to have you," she said later that evening as they cleaned up after the party. Ethan looked at her, his face softening. "I'm the lucky one," he replied, though the words felt heavy in his mouth. As Mia placed the last plate in the dishwasher, she turned to him. "I was thinking we could start decorating the nursery next weekend. What do you think?" Ethan nodded absently. "Yeah, that sounds great." Mia frowned slightly. She had noticed his distracted behavior over the past few weeks, but had chalked it up to the pressures of work. "Are you okay?" she asked gently. "Of course," Ethan replied quickly, forcing a smile. "Just a lot on my mind." Mia walked over and wrapped her arms around him. "You know you can talk to me about anything, right?" Ethan stiffened for a moment before relaxing into her embrace. "I know," he said, though the weight of his secret pressed against his chest like a vice. That night, as Mia drifted off to sleep beside him, Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The memories of his time overseas and the choices he had made haunted him. He had told himself it was a mistake, a moment of weakness, but the truth was far more complicated. Now, with Daniel's threats looming over him and the baby on the way, Ethan felt like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath his feet. He turned to look at Mia, her face peaceful in sleep. He had promised to protect her, to give her the life she deserved. Yet, with every passing day, he felt that promise slipping further out of reach. Ethan's life changed forever during his second deployment to Afghanistan. The dry, unforgiving landscape mirrored the emotional desolation he often felt, though he could never quite explain why. The days were grueling, filled with the constant threat of danger, and the nights were long, haunted by the faces of comrades he'd lost. It was during one of these long nights that Major Daniel Pierce first approached him. Daniel was everything Ethan aspired to be, confident, respected, and unwavering in his command. At 45, Daniel had served nearly 20 years in the military and wore his authority like armor. To Ethan, he was more than a superior. He was someone to emulate, a mentor who seemed to understand the unspoken struggles that came with wearing the uniform. Their connection began innocently enough. Late-night conversations over shared cigarettes, trading war stories, and discussing their lives back home. Daniel often spoke of his family, a wife and 2 teenage sons he rarely saw due to his demanding career. Ethan, in turn, shared stories of Mia and their dreams of starting a family once he returned. But as the months dragged on and the weight of deployment bore down on them, their conversations took a different turn. One particularly harrowing day, Ethan's unit narrowly escaped an ambush. The adrenaline rush had left him shaken, and as he sat alone in the barracks that evening, Daniel found him. "Rough day," Daniel said, handing Ethan a flask. Ethan took a long sip, the burn of the whiskey grounding him momentarily. "It's getting harder," he admitted. "Every day feels heavier." Daniel nodded, sitting beside him. "It doesn't get easier, but sometimes you find ways to cope." Their eyes met, and for a moment the world around them seemed to fade. Ethan felt an inexplicable pull, a mix of vulnerability and something he couldn't quite name. "You're stronger than you think," Daniel said softly, his hand briefly touching Ethan's shoulder. Ethan didn't pull away. That moment marked the beginning of a relationship that Ethan would later struggle to define. It wasn't love, at least not in the traditional sense. It was a need, a desperate attempt to feel something other than fear and despair. Daniel became both a refuge and a source of confusion, a secret that Ethan carried like a ticking time bomb. As their bond deepened, so did Ethan's guilt. Every letter he received from Mia felt like a knife to the heart, a reminder of the life he had promised her. Yet, he couldn't seem to stop. The isolation of deployment, coupled with Daniel's relentless pursuit, created a storm Ethan was powerless to resist. By the time the deployment ended, Ethan was drowning in shame. He returned to the US determined to leave that chapter behind, to focus on his marriage and the future he and Mia were building. But Daniel had other plans. When Ethan stepped off the plane at the military base in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, the first thing he saw was Mia's glowing face in the crowd, her wide smile, the tears streaming down her cheeks, and the way she ran to him with open arms made him feel like a hero returning from battle. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to believe that he could leave everything behind: the war, the secrets, the mistakes. "I missed you so much," Mia whispered, as she buried her face in his chest. Ethan held her tightly, inhaling the familiar scent of her lavender shampoo. "I missed you too," he said, though the words felt hollow, weighed down by the guilt he carried. Their drive home was filled with laughter and stories. Mia updated him on everything he had missed: the new neighbors, her recent promotion at the local hospital, and her decision to join a prenatal yoga class. Ethan listened intently, nodding and smiling in all the right places, but his mind was elsewhere. That night, as they lay in bed, Mia snuggled close to him, her hand resting on his chest. "I'm so glad you're home," she said. "I don't think I could have done this without you." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tightening. He wanted to confess everything, to lay bare the truth of what had happened overseas. But how could he? How could he destroy the happiness she felt, the life they had planned together? Instead, he kissed her forehead and whispered, "I'll always be here for you." The days that followed were a whirlwind of adjustments. Ethan threw himself into the routines of civilian life, helping Mia prepare for the baby's arrival and attending doctor's appointments. On the surface, everything seemed perfect, but the shadows of his past lingered, growing darker with each passing day. Daniel's calls began a week after Ethan's return. The first time the phone rang, Ethan saw the name flash on the screen and immediately silenced it. But Daniel was persistent. "You can't just ignore me," Daniel said when Ethan finally picked up, his voice cold and sharp. "What do you want?" Ethan hissed, stepping out of the house to avoid Mia overhearing. "I think you know," Daniel replied. "You don't get to just walk away from this, from me." Ethan's chest tightened. "It was a mistake," he said through gritted teeth. "It never should have happened." Daniel laughed bitterly. "You think you can erase me like that? Let me remind you, Ethan, I know things about you that your wife doesn't. Things she wouldn't forgive." The threat was clear, and Ethan felt the walls closing in. One evening, as Mia sat in the nursery folding tiny onesies, Ethan stood in the doorway watching her. He wanted to tell her everything, to beg for her forgiveness, and hope that their love was strong enough to withstand the truth. "Ethan, are you okay?" Mia asked, noticing the troubled look on his face. He forced a smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just thinking about how lucky I am to have you." Mia smiled, her eyes brimming with love. "We're lucky to have you too." But Ethan didn't feel lucky. He felt trapped in a web of lies, with Daniel pulling the strings. As the weeks passed, Ethan grew increasingly paranoid. He deleted every message and call from Daniel, afraid that Mia might stumble upon them. Yet no matter how hard he tried to distance himself, Daniel always found a way to remind him of the secret they shared. Ethan's worst fears were realized one afternoon when Daniel sent him a photo, a grainy image taken during one of their nights together overseas. "Imagine what Mia would think if she saw this," the accompanying message read. Ethan stared at the screen, his hands trembling. He knew then that Daniel wasn't going to let him go without a fight. Ethan's hands trembled as he stared at the damning photo on his phone. The image, though blurry, was unmistakable. A stark reminder of his infidelity and a threat to the life he had worked so hard to rebuild. He deleted the photo immediately, but the knot in his stomach remained, tightening with every passing second. Mia found him that evening in the garage, sitting on a folding chair with his head in his hands. "Ethan?" she called softly, concern etched on her face. "Are you okay?" He looked up at her, his eyes red-rimmed and weary. "Yeah, just thinking about some things." Mia walked over and knelt in front of him, placing a hand on his knee. "You've been so distant lately," she said gently. "I know you're dealing with a lot, but I'm here for you. Whatever it is, we can face it together." Ethan wanted to believe her, but the weight of his secret felt like an anchor dragging him into darkness. "I'm fine," he lied, forcing a weak smile. "Just work stuff." Mia studied him for a moment before nodding reluctantly. "Okay, but promise me you'll talk to me if something's wrong." "I promise," Ethan said, though the words felt like ash in his mouth. That night, as Mia slept peacefully beside him, Ethan lay awake, his mind racing. Daniel's threats were escalating, and Ethan knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. He had to find a way to stop him. But how? Confronting Daniel directly felt like lighting a match in a room filled with gasoline. The next morning, Ethan received another message. "We need to talk. You know where to find me." The accompanying address was a motel on the outskirts of town. Ethan's first instinct was to ignore it, but he knew Daniel wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. The motel room was dimly lit, the air heavy with the stench of stale cigarettes. Daniel sat in a worn armchair, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp and calculating. "You're late," he said, as Ethan stepped inside. Ethan clenched his fists, fighting the urge to lash out. "What do you want from me, Daniel?" Daniel smirked, leaning back in his chair. "I want what's fair. You think you can walk away from this, from me, and pretend it never happened? I don't think so." "It was a mistake," Ethan said through gritted teeth. "I love my wife. She's pregnant with my child. I can't let this ruin everything." Daniel's expression darkened. "Your wife? Your child? Don't act like you're some saint, Ethan. You made your choices, just like I did. And now you're going to face the consequences." Ethan took a step closer, his voice low and dangerous. "If you come near my family, I swear—" "What?" Daniel interrupted, rising to his feet. "You'll do what? Don't forget who you're dealing with." The tension in the room was palpable as the two men stared each other down. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "Relax, Ethan. I'm not here to destroy your life, not yet anyway. But if you want me to keep quiet, You're going to have to do something for me. Ethan's heart sank. What do you want? Daniel's smirk returned. You'll find out soon enough. Over the next few weeks, Daniel's demands became increasingly manipulative. He asked for money, favors, and even suggested meeting up under the guise of catching up. Ethan complied reluctantly, terrified of what Daniel might do if he refused. Meanwhile, Mia noticed the change in her husband. He was jumpy, withdrawn, and constantly checking his phone. One evening, as they sat on the couch, she finally confronted him. Ethan, what's going on? You've been so distant lately. Are you seeing someone else? Her voice cracked on the last words, and Ethan felt his heart shatter. No, Mia, he said quickly, taking her hands in his. I would never do that to you. I've just been dealing with some things from work. It's nothing to worry about. Mia searched his eyes, looking for the truth, but all she found was a man desperately trying to hold himself together. Okay, she said quietly. But if there's something you're not telling me, please, just be honest. I can handle it. Ethan nodded, though the weight of his secret felt heavier than ever. Ethan's efforts to keep his life intact were unraveling faster than he could control. Each day brought a new demand from Daniel, a threat, a reminder of the power he held over Ethan's life. The stress was eating away at him, and Mia, though she tried to be supportive, was growing increasingly frustrated. One afternoon, Mia found Ethan sitting in the nursery, his head in his hands. Ethan, she said softly, her voice laced with worry. We need to talk. He looked up at her, his face pale and drawn. About what? She hesitated, then sat down beside him. About whatever's going on with you. You've been distant, moody, and it's like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. I can't help you if you don't let me in. Ethan's chest tightened. He wanted to tell her everything, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he shook his head. It's nothing, Mia. I'm just adjusting to being back. Mia frowned, clearly unconvinced. Ethan, I love you. But I can't keep pretending everything's okay when it's not. Please, just tell me the truth. Ethan's resolve crumbled under her pleading gaze. I've made some mistakes, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. But I'm trying to fix them. I promise. Mia's eyes softened, though her concern remained. Whatever it is, we'll get through it together. But you have to let me in, Ethan. Secrets will only tear us apart. He nodded, though the weight of his secret pressed harder against his chest. A week later, Ethan's world came crashing down. He was at work when he received a frantic call from Mia. Her voice was panicked, and he could hear her sobbing. Ethan! Something's wrong, she cried. I went to the doctor today, and they ran some tests. They said, I have HIV. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. What? He whispered, his heart pounding. How could this happen? Mia continued, her voice breaking. Ethan, I've only ever been with you. How could this happen? Ethan's mind raced as he struggled to process her words. The room seemed to spin around him, and he gripped the edge of his desk to steady himself. I'll come home, he said quickly. We'll figure this out. I'll be there soon. When Ethan arrived home, Mia was sitting on the couch, her face pale and tear-streaked. Tell me the truth, she demanded, her voice trembling. Did you cheat on me? Ethan's heart shattered as he looked at her. He knew there was no escaping the truth now. I didn't mean for it to happen, he said quietly, his voice filled with regret. It was a mistake, Mia. I was weak, and I'm so sorry. Mia stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. You betrayed me, she whispered. You put my life and our baby's life at risk. How could you do this to us? Ethan reached for her, but she recoiled. Don't, she said sharply. Don't touch me. Her words cut deeper than any physical wound. Ethan sank into a chair, his head in his hands. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he said weakly. "I never wanted to hurt you." "But you did," Mia said, her voice cold. "You destroyed everything." The days that followed were a blur of pain and confrontation. Mia moved into the guest bedroom, refusing to speak to Ethan, except when absolutely necessary. She scheduled additional tests for herself and the baby, praying that her child hadn't been affected. Meanwhile, Ethan's nightmares became more vivid, his guilt manifesting in ways he couldn't control. He avoided Daniel's calls and messages, but the damage had already been done. One night, as Ethan sat alone in the darkened living room, his phone buzzed with a new message. "You think you can ignore me? Think again." The accompanying photo was of Ethan and Mia, taken outside their home. Ethan's blood ran cold. Daniel wasn't just a distant threat anymore. He was here, watching them. Ethan's hands trembled as he gripped his phone, staring at the photo of him and Mia. His worst fear had materialized. Daniel wasn't just a distant threat anymore. He had breached their lives. Anxiety churned in his stomach as he stared out the window, half expecting Daniel to appear at any moment. The following morning, Mia found Ethan pacing in the kitchen, his eyes bloodshot from another sleepless night. "What's going on, Ethan?" she asked, her voice weary. "You're acting like you're being hunted." Ethan froze. He wanted to tell her everything, to unburden himself, but he feared it would only put her in more danger. Instead, he shook his head. "It's nothing," he lied. "Just stress from work." Mia's eyes narrowed. "You keep saying that, but it's obvious there's more to it. How am I supposed to trust you when you won't be honest with me?" Her words stung, but Ethan couldn't bring himself to respond. He was trapped in a web of his own making, and every move he made only seemed to tighten the strands around him. Later that evening, Ethan sat in his car outside the motel where he and Daniel had last met. He had received another message. "We need to talk. Don't keep me waiting." Ethan knew it was a trap, but he also knew he had no choice. If he didn't confront Daniel, his family would be in even greater danger. Daniel was waiting for him in the same dingy room, his expression smug as Ethan stepped inside. "I was starting to think you wouldn't show," Daniel said, leaning casually against the wall. "What do you want?" Ethan demanded, his voice sharp with anger and fear. Daniel's smirk widened. "You know what I want. I want you to stop pretending like you're some saint who can just walk away from his sins. You and I are bound together, Ethan, whether you like it or not." Ethan clenched his fists. "Stay away from my family. If you come near them again, I swear I'll—" "You'll what?" Daniel interrupted, his tone mocking. "Call the cops? Tell them about us? Go ahead. I'm sure your wife would love to hear the whole story." Ethan's anger boiled over. He lunged at Daniel, shoving him against the wall. "If you hurt her, or my child, I'll kill you," he growled. Daniel laughed, unbothered by the threat. "You're not in control here, Ethan. I am, and you'd do well to remember that." Ethan released him, stepping back as the weight of his desperation crushed him. He felt like a man on the edge of a cliff, with no way forward and no way back. When Ethan returned home, Mia was waiting for him in the living room. Her face was pale, and her eyes were swollen from crying. "We need to talk," she said, her voice trembling. Ethan's heart sank. "What is it?" She held up her phone, displaying an email she had received. It was from Daniel. "I thought you should know what your husband's been up to," the email read. Attached were photos and messages that detailed Ethan's affair. Mia looked at Ethan, tears streaming down her face. "Is this true?" she whispered. Ethan couldn't speak. The silence stretched between them, heavy with betrayal and heartbreak. "How could you do this to me?" Mia cried, her voice breaking. "To us? To our baby?" "I'm sorry," Ethan said, his voice barely audible. "I never meant for this to happen. I was weak, and I made a terrible mistake." "A mistake?" Mia repeated, her voice rising. "This isn't just a mistake, Ethan. You lied to me. You put my life in danger. How could you—" Her voice cracked, and she covered her face with her hands, sobbing. Ethan reached for her, but she pulled away. "Don't touch me," she said through her tears. "I can't even look at you right now." Ethan stood frozen, his heart breaking as he watched the woman he loved fall apart because of his actions. He had destroyed the life they had built together, and there was no way to undo the damage. As the days passed, Mia retreated further into herself, barely speaking to Ethan. She focused all her energy on preparing for the baby, avoiding him as much as possible. Ethan, consumed by guilt and fear, tried to find a way to make things right, but every attempt only seemed to make things worse. Daniel, meanwhile, continued to taunt him, sending messages that twisted the knife deeper into Ethan's already broken heart. One evening, Ethan received a text that made his blood run cold. "If I can't have you, no one will." The words were a chilling reminder that Daniel's obsession wasn't just a threat to Ethan, it was a danger to everyone he cared about. Ethan paced the bedroom, gripping his phone tightly. Daniel's chilling message echoed in his mind. Fear for Mia and the baby gnawed at him, and he realized this nightmare wouldn't end unless he confronted it head-on. But he was out of options, trapped in a web of lies and guilt that had already cost him everything. Downstairs, Mia sat at the kitchen table, her face pale and expressionless. She had barely eaten in days, her energy focused solely on the baby growing inside her. Despite her anger and heartbreak, her maternal instincts urged her to keep going, if only for her child's sake. Ethan approached her cautiously. "Mia," he began, his voice hesitant. She looked up at him, her expression cold. "What do you want?" He sat down across from her, trying to find the right words. "I know I've destroyed your trust. I know I've hurt you in ways I can't even begin to fix. But I need to tell you the full truth." Mia crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "The full truth? Isn't that what you were supposed to give me from the beginning?" Ethan flinched but pushed forward. "There's someone I was involved with. He's the one who's been threatening us. He sent you that email, and now he's saying he'll hurt you and the baby if I don't do what he wants." Mia's jaw tightened. "So, not only did you cheat on me, but you brought a psychopath into our lives. Do you even realize what you've done, Ethan?" Tears welled up in his eyes. "I do, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect you and our child. I just need you to trust me one last time." "Trust you?" Mia's voice broke, her pain spilling over. "You're the reason we're in this mess, Ethan. How am I supposed to trust you when every word out of your mouth has been a lie?" Ethan hung his head, unable to meet her gaze. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I swear I'll fix this." That night, Ethan made a decision. He packed a small bag and left a note for Mia, explaining that he was going to confront Daniel and end this once and for all. Mia found the note the next morning. Her hands trembled as she read his words, a mix of anger and fear coursing through her. She didn't know whether to hate him for leaving or pray for his safety. Ethan met Daniel at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The air was thick with tension as the two men faced each other, the weight of their toxic relationship hanging between them. "You actually showed up," Daniel said, his voice dripping with mockery. "I'm impressed." "This ends now," Ethan said, his voice firm. "Leave Mia and my child out of this. If you want to ruin someone, ruin me." Daniel laughed, a cold and bitter sound. "You still don't get it, do you? This was never just about you. It's about power, and right now I have all of it." Ethan clenched his fists. "You don't have to do this, Daniel. We can both walk away and move on." Daniel's expression darkened. "Walk away? After everything we've been through? You don't get to walk away from me, Ethan. Not ever." Back at the house, Mia sat by the window, staring out into the night. A part of her hated Ethan for what he had done, but another part of her feared for his safety. Despite everything, she still cared for him, if only because of the life they had created together. Her phone buzzed with a new message. She hesitated before opening it, her breath catching as she read the words. "You should have stayed out of this, Mia. Now you'll pay the price." Panic gripped her as she dialed Ethan's number, but it went straight to voicemail. She tried again, her hands shaking, but there was no answer. At the warehouse, the confrontation escalated. Ethan and Daniel exchanged heated words, their anger boiling over into physical violence. In the chaos, Ethan managed to wrestle Daniel's phone away from him. He saw the messages Daniel had sent to Mia, and his heart sank. "What did you do?" Ethan demanded, his voice shaking with rage. Daniel smirked, blood dripping from a cut on his lip. "Just a little reminder of what happens when people cross me." Ethan's fury erupted. He lunged at Daniel, pinning him against the wall. "If you've hurt her—" "What?" Daniel taunted. "You'll kill me? Go ahead. But it won't stop what's already in motion." Ethan released him, stepping back as the weight of Daniel's words sank in. He realized he needed to get home, now.